All right, let's jump into a deep dive on World War II.
Sounds good.
You want to get a handle on the key events and the big names, right? Especially how it all started.
Exactly.
Well, this war is so massive, we're going to tackle this deep dive in 3 parts.
Makes sense.
But don't worry, we're going to make sure you get all the important stuff without getting overloaded.
That's the plan. We'll focus on those pivotal turning points and really understand how these seemingly small events and choices just snowballed into this global conflict.
Yeah, and you think a war this famous wouldn't have many surprises left.
You would think.
But trust me, even if you're a World War II buff, our sources have some serious, like, wait, what moments.
I'm intrigued.
For example, have you heard of Japan's Unit 731?
Oh, yes.
It's pretty chilling. It's a program of medical experiments on prisoners in occupied Manchuria.
Definitely a horrific example of wartime atrocities. We'll get into that later.
Okay.
But for now, let's start with the rise of fascism and ultranationalism in the 1920s and 30s.
Okay, so Germany, Italy, and Japan.
Oh, those are the big ones.
So these ideologies, they kind of fueled the whole thing, right?
Yes.
What was going on in the world that allowed these extreme views to, take root?
Well, you have to imagine the aftermath of World War I, right? You have nations struggling with economic depression, political instability, and widespread social unrest.
Right. The world was a mess.
It was. And these conditions created fertile ground for these extremist ideologies that offered a sense of order and a promise to restore national pride.
So people were desperate for answers.
Yeah.
And these ideologies provided solutions that were, well, pretty twisted.
Yeah, some pretty dark solutions.
Okay, so how did these ideologies specifically, shape the ambitions of Germany, Italy, and Japan?
Well, they shared this dangerous mix of extreme national pride, resentment towards other nations, and a belief in their own racial and cultural superiority.
Okay.
And leaders like Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese military elite, they exploited these feelings. They painted this vision of world domination and the need to eliminate perceived enemies to achieve it. And they used propaganda and intimidation to silence opposition and control their populations.
So it's interesting that they're all kind of on the same team, but these ideologies eventually caused friction within the Axis powers, right?
Absolutely.
It's like mixing a bunch of volatile ingredients together. You're bound to get an explosion.
Exactly. Each nation had its own agenda, which just added to the complexity of the whole conflict. For
Right.
example, Japan.
Right.
They felt disrespected by the Western powers, despite being on the winning side of World War I.
Right.
So they were already on this path to ultranationalism even before the war ended.
Interesting. So they were harboring this resentment and ambition even while the rest of the world was trying to recover from the First World War.
That's right.
And then they went all in on a massive rearmament program, right?
Yeah, they did.
Didn't they keep a lot of their military development, especially their research into chemical and biological weapons, super secret? Why all the secrecy?
Well, partly to avoid international scrutiny.
Right. Makes sense.
But also, secrecy was deeply embedded in their military culture. It was influenced by the samurai code and their warrior traditions.
Okay.
Deception was seen as a legitimate strategy in their quest for dominance.
So it's like they're playing a high-stakes game of Risk and they're not sharing their battle plans.
Pretty much.
Then they made a move that shocked everyone, the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. What was the strategy there?
Well, they wanted to control the region's vast resources.
Versus. Okay.
So they staged an incident on a Chinese railway and blamed it on Chinese dissidents.
They made it up.
They used this fabricated event as a justification for a full-scale invasion.
Oh, wow.
They occupied Manchuria and set up a puppet state.
So it wasn't just a military takeover, though, right? The occupation was brutal.
Absolutely. Rape, murder, and forced labor were widespread
Oh, Mike.
and often encouraged by the Japanese leadership.
It's crazy how their warrior code, where surrender was seen as the ultimate dishonor, was applied so ruthlessly to the Chinese people. And of course, we can't forget about Unit 731, that medical research facility
Right.
where they conducted experiments on Chinese prisoners.
Thousands of prisoners were subjected to inhumane medical experiments.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is, and these atrocities are crucial to understanding the full scope of the conflict.
Yeah, it's a truly chilling chapter in history now while Japan was expanding in Asia. Mussolini was busy making his own power play in Europe.
That's right.
He had this vision of recreating the Roman Empire, right?
Yes, he did. His ambition to revive the Roman Empire led him to invade Ethiopia in 1935.
So both Japan and Italy were obsessed with recreating their past glories to justify their actions in the present.
Exactly.
But it was the rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler that really changed the game in Europe.
Absolutely.
He was a master manipulator, wasn't he?
Hitler's rise to power was a perfect storm of ambition, manipulation, and this chillingly effective propaganda machine.
Right. He knew how to exploit people's fears and prejudices.
Yes, he did.
And he turned them into a tool for his own political gain.
Exactly.
Let's back up for a second and talk about his background. He was actually Austrian, not German, right?
Right.
And he fought in World War I. How did those experiences shape his, twisted worldview?
Well, his Austrian origin fueled his desire for a unified Greater Germany,
Okay.
one that encompassed all German-speaking people.
Okay.
And his experience in World War I, especially Germany's defeat, left him with deep bitterness and resentment towards the Allied powers.
Right. He felt like Germany had been betrayed.
He did, and he viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a national humiliation.
Yeah, the treaty that imposed those harsh penalties on Germany after the war.
Right. He wanted to avenge that.
And it was while he was in prison after that failed beer hall putsch that he wrote Mein Kampf, right?
Yes,
That book was basically his manifesto,
It was a blueprint for the Nazi ideology.
laying out his disturbing vision for Germany.
It's filled with racist and anti-Semitic rhetoric.
It's incredible and disturbing how a book filled with such hateful ideas could gain so much traction.
Well, Hitler understood how to tap into people's anxieties and frustrations.
Okay.
He offered scapegoats for their problems and a vision of a glorious future under his leadership.
So he gave them someone to blame and something to believe in.
Right. He was a master propagandist. He skillfully used mass rallies,
Mhm.
radio broadcasts, and a tightly controlled media to spread his message and consolidate his power.
And his rise to power was shockingly fast by 1933. He was Chancellor of Germany.
That's right.
And that transformation of Germany into a Nazi state began almost immediately.
Absolutely. Once in power, the Nazis wasted no time.
Okay.
They moved swiftly to silence any opposition, establishing a totalitarian regime with control over every aspect of German society.
It's mind-blowing how Britain and France didn't react more forcefully to Hitler's early acts of aggression.
Yes.
He was testing the waters, pushing the boundaries of the Treaty of Versailles,
Right.
and they just let him get away with it. What were they thinking?
Well, a major factor was the prevailing mood of appeasement in Britain and France. Still reeling from World War I, they desperately wanted to avoid another war.
Makes sense, but it seems like a risky strategy.
It was many believed that accommodating Hitler's demands was the best way to prevent another global conflict.
So they were hoping they could appease his ambitions and avoid a bigger problem down the line?
Exactly.
Okay, let's track some of those early acts of aggression in 1935. He reintroduced conscription, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes.
What was the reaction?
Wild protests, but no real action.
Really? So they just let it slide?
Pretty much, and
Yeah.
it emboldened Hitler. He saw it as a sign of weakness.
Wow. And then in 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, that region bordering France that was supposed to remain demilitarized.
Right.
He was really pushing his luck with that move.
It was a gamble, but one that paid off.
And the French didn't do anything.
They chose diplomacy over military action.
That was a close call.
It was.
And then there was his involvement in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
That kind of flew under the radar, didn't it?
It did. He provided troops and weapons to support General Franco's nationalist faction.
So he was getting his hands dirty in another country's conflict.
Exactly. This gave his forces valuable combat experience and allowed them to test new weapons and tactics.
And again, a clear violation of international agreements.
It was.
But the Allied powers still hesitant to intervene.
Yes, they were.
It seems like they kept giving him an inch and he took a mile every time.
That's a good way to put it.
And then came the annexation of Austria into Germany in 1938. This wasn't just a military takeover. It was presented as a happy reunion, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Bringing the German people together.
Right. Hitler expertly exploited the strong cultural and historical ties between Germany and Austria.
Okay.
He portrayed the Anschluss as the fulfillment of a unified Greater Germany,
Okay.
and he used propaganda to create a sense of inevitability.
So he was a master of manipulating public opinion.
He was.
And the Austrian government, facing pressure both internally and externally, eventually caved. So he was getting bolder, and the world was watching. His next target was Czechoslovakia.
Right. Specifically the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population.
And this is where that idea of appeasement really comes into play, right?
Yes.
Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister,
Right.
he desperately wanted to avoid war at all costs.
Yes, he did.
He engaged in a series of negotiations with Hitler.
Which culminated in the Munich Agreement.
That agreement basically handed over the Sudetenland to Germany, and they didn't even include Czechoslovakia in the discussions.
Well, he didn't.
Talk about being thrown under the bus. What was Chamberlain thinking?
He believed that giving in to Hitler's demands would satisfy his ambitions and avert a larger war.
So he thought he could appease Hitler and avoid a bigger conflict.
Exactly. He famously returned to Britain, proclaiming peace for our time.
And of course, history proved him tragically wrong.
It did.
Because within months, Hitler took over the rest of Czechoslovakia,
Yes, he did.
proving that appeasement had completely backfired. He'd shown the world he couldn't be trusted, and his hunger for conquest was far from satisfied.
The takeover of Czechoslovakia shattered any remaining illusions about Hitler's true intentions.
What a mess. And then in a move that probably left everyone's jaws on the floor,
Yes.
Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin.
Right. His ideological enemy.
It was a total shocker.
The Nazi-Soviet pact was a classic example of realpolitik.
Okay, real
A
politics.
pragmatic approach to international relations based on power, not on ethical considerations.
I see.
It allowed Hitler and Stalin to carve up Eastern Europe and secure their borders while preparing for war with the West.
So it was a temporary alliance of convenience.
Exactly, a pact born of convenience, not trust.
And as history shows, it wouldn't last long.
It didn't.
It was a cynical move, for sure, and this pact gave Hitler the green light for his next conquest.
The invasion of Poland,
On September 1st, 1939, German forces stormed into Poland,
employing their devastating blitzkrieg tactics.
and this marked the official start of World War II.
It did.
2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany.
Right.
So this invasion was the final straw. Tell me more about these blitzkrieg tactics. They were a game changer, weren't they?
Blitzkrieg literally means lightning war,
Okay.
and it was a revolutionary approach to warfare.
Okay.
It involved the coordinated use of tanks, aircraft, and highly mobile infantry.
So it was all about speed and overwhelming force.
Exactly. Tanks spearheaded the assault, while aircraft provided close air support, devastating enemy defenses, and creating chaos and confusion.
You were basically overwhelmed before they even knew what hit them.
Right.
And just a few weeks later, as part of their agreement with Hitler, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east,
Yes, they did.
effectively wiping the country off the map.
The partition of Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union highlighted the cynical nature of their pact
Right.
and their ruthless ambition.
It also foreshadowed the horrors awaiting Eastern Europe under Nazi occupation.
It did.
So Poland is gone. The war has officially begun, and then things get kind of weird. There's this lull on the Western Front that's been called the phony war.
Right.
It seems like a bit of an anticlimactic start to such a massive conflict.
It does seem that way. The phony war was a period of tense anticipation and preparation for both sides.
Okay.
While there was no major fighting on land, Britain and France mobilized their forces, and Germany consolidated its gains.
So it was a strategic pause, both sides kind of playing a waiting game.
Yes.
But there were some interesting incidents during this time, like the Altmark incident.
Ah, yes. The Altmark was a German supply ship that had captured British sailors,
Right.
and a British destroyer, the HMS Cossack, hunted it down in Norwegian waters
Oh, wow.
and boarded it, rescuing the prisoners in a daring raid.
That's pretty bold.
It was this incident, though small in scale, boosted British morale.
Right. It showed they weren't just sitting around.
Exactly.
But the phony war came to a sudden and dramatic end in May 1940 when Germany invaded France and the Low Countries.
Yes, it did.
The invasion of France was a stunning display of military might and strategic brilliance.
It really was. Hitler's generals bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line
Conventional line.
and struck through the Ardennes forest, a move the French considered impossible.
Because of the terrain.
Exactly. This allowed them to outflank the Allied defenses, causing chaos and panic.
The speed and aggression of the German advance was shocking. It seemed like the French army, once considered Europe's most powerful, was crumbling before their eyes. How did it happen so fast?
Several factors contributed to the rapid German victory. Their superior tactics, particularly the effective use of blitzkrieg, played a significant role.
So blitzkrieg again?
Yes. But also the demoralization of the French army and their leadership, along with a series of strategic miscalculations, allowed for the swift German advance.
So France was caught off guard and unprepared for the type of warfare the Germans were unleashing.
They were.
And then, of course, there's the dramatic evacuation of Dunkirk, one of the most heroic yet tragic episodes of the war.
Over 300,000 Allied troops were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. facing capture or annihilation, and this desperate rescue operation unfolded with a flotilla of over 800 vessels crossing the English Channel under constant air attack.
It's amazing that they managed to pull that off.
It is a remarkable feat of improvisation and bravery.
But even with so many rescued, it was still a defeat, right?
It was ultimately a retreat. The British Army was forced to abandon vast quantities of equipment and supplies, and tragically not everyone made it out.
Right.
The sinking of the Lancastria, a British ocean liner involved in the evacuation,
Okay.
was a devastating loss of life.
Wow, I've never even heard of that.
It's often overshadowed by the Dunkirk evacuation itself.
But the loss of life was even greater than the Titanic.
It was a major tragedy.
It's hard to believe a disaster of that magnitude is so little known, a stark reminder that even in the midst of heroism, war's toll is immense.
It is.
By June 1940, France had fallen and Hitler was on a roll. How did he manage to conquer a nation that was considered a major military power so quickly?
It was a combination of factors, strategic missteps by the French, the effectiveness of German tactics, and a fundamental difference in leadership and morale.
Okay.
Hitler, driven by his fanatical ideology, was willing to take risks and push his army to the limits.
Right, he was all in.
The French leadership, on the other hand, was plagued by indecision and lacked faith in their own capabilities.
So France was outmaneuvered and outgunned, both on the battlefield and in terms of leadership.
Yes.
With France out of the picture, Britain was suddenly standing alone against the Nazi war machine. It must have felt like the darkest hour, with the very real threat of invasion looming large.
It did. Churchill, who had just become prime minister weeks before the fall of France, rallied the British people, vowing to fight on no matter the cost.
Those are some powerful words. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be, we shall never surrender. It's the kind of speech that echoes through history.
It is.
So while Hitler began making plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, there were some serious roadblocks in his way, right?
The biggest obstacle was the Royal Navy, which controlled the English Channel. They posed a significant threat to any invading force.
Okay, so the British Navy was a major deterrent.
It was the German Navy, despite some early successes, was simply no match for the British fleet in a direct confrontation.
Right. And Hitler also had to consider the fierce resistance he would face from the British people.
Yes, they were determined to defend their homeland to the death.
It seems like even with all his victories, Hitler was facing an uphill battle against a determined island nation. But before we dive into the Battle of Britain, let's shift gears and look at how the war was expanding beyond Europe.
Okay.
Mussolini, eager to prove himself as Hitler's ally, set his sights on North Africa.
Yes, he did.
Targeting British possessions like Egypt. What was at stake in this new theater of war?
North Africa was strategically vital. Control of the Suez Canal was crucial for both sides.
Right. The Suez Canal, that critical waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. The British needed to safeguard their supply lines to their empire in the east,
Oh.
while the Axis powers saw North Africa as a stepping stone to controlling the Middle East and its valuable oil resources.
So it was a battle for control of vital resources and strategic access in September 1940. Italian forces invaded Egypt from their colony in Libya. The British, though outnumbered, were ready to pull out some surprises.
We were.
One of those surprises was a daring raid on Taranto.
Taranto, a major Italian naval base.
Using outdated swordfish biplanes, British aircraft launched a nighttime attack, crippling a significant portion of the Italian fleet.
It was a remarkable feat.
Talk about turning the tables. They took a page out of the Blitzkrieg playbook and used speed and surprise to their advantage. It was a classic David versus Goliath story, with the British pulling off a remarkable victory.
It was.
But the situation in North Africa was about to get even more interesting with the arrival of Erwin Rommel, the German general who would become known as the Desert Fox.
Ah, yes, the Desert Fox.
What made him such a formidable opponent?
Rommel was a brilliant commander known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to inspire his troops. He breathed new life into the Axis campaign.
So his arrival really shook things up in North Africa.
It did.
We'll definitely have to delve into his exploits later.
We will.
But for now, let's shift our focus back to the Atlantic and the crucial battle for control of the sea lanes, the Battle of the Atlantic. Why was this battle so important, especially for Britain?
The Battle of the Atlantic was a life-or-death struggle for Britain as an island nation. They were heavily reliant on imports for food, raw materials, and war supplies.
Okay.
And the German Navy, primarily using U-boats, their submarines, aimed to cut off this lifeline starving Britain of vital resources.
The U-boat threat must have been terrifying, these submarines lurking beneath the waves, sinking merchant ships and warships alike.
It was a constant threat.
I can only imagine the pressure to find ways to counter them. What was anti-submarine warfare like in those early years of the war?
It was incredibly challenging. Sonar technology, which uses sound waves to detect underwater objects, was still in its early stages.
So it was difficult to find those submarines?
The Germans were also using effective wolfpack tactics, coordinating groups of U-boats to attack convoys.
Making it even harder to defend against them.
Exactly.
I read that Churchill himself said the U-boat threat was what worried him the most during the war. What were some of the key strategies the British used to fight back against this underwater menace?
One of the most important strategies was the convoy system.
Okay, so grouping merchant ships together and escorting them with warships.
Exactly, providing them with protection and making it more difficult for U-boats to isolate and attack individual vessels.
That makes sense.
They also developed radar technology,
Okay.
which allowed aircraft and warships to detect U-boats on the surface, even in darkness or bad weather.
So it was a constant technological race to stay one step ahead.
It was.
And then there were the cam ships, those merchant vessels disguised as harmless cargo ships but secretly carrying aircraft.
Yes,
That sounds like something out of a spy movie.
it does a bit. Cam ships were a clever tactic used to lure U-boats into thinking they were easy targets. When the U-boat surfaced to attack, the cam ship would launch its Hurricane fighter to engage the submarine.
So it's a trap.
It was a risky tactic for the pilots involved,
Right.
but it proved to be an effective way to disrupt U-boat operations.
So while this deadly game of cat and mouse was going on in the Atlantic, things were heating up again in the Balkans.
Lessons they were.
Mussolini, after those setbacks in North Africa, was itching for a win and decided to invade Greece.
It's true.
Why Greece?
Mussolini underestimated Greece.
Okay.
He saw it as a weak target, a chance to redeem Italy's tarnished reputation after their failures in North Africa.
So he thought it would be an easy victory.
He did, but the Greek army, although smaller and less equipped, put up a fierce resistance.
Oh, wow.
They repelled the Italian invasion and pushed them back into Albania.
So it backfired on him.
It did. This unexpected setback for the Axis powers drew Britain into the conflict
Okay.
as they sent troops to support their Greek allies.
So Mussolini's miscalculation dragged Britain into another fight, and Hitler must have been thrilled.
Not exactly hit. Hitler was already frustrated by Mussolini's blunders in North Africa,
Okay.
and now he had to divert resources and troops to bail out his unreliable ally.
Wow. So the Balkans were becoming a thorn in Hitler's side, delaying his plans for a bigger conquest in the East.
They were.
What did he do about it?
In April 1941, German forces launched a lightning campaign through Yugoslavia and Greece, crushing all resistance in just a few weeks.
So Hitler, as usual, responded with overwhelming force.
He did.
And what happened to the British troops that were there to help Greece?
Facing the overwhelming force of the German army, the British were forced to evacuate.
Another setback for them in the early stages of the war?
It was, but the most dramatic episode of this Balkan campaign was yet to come, the invasion of Crete.
I've heard about the Battle of Crete, but haven't really dug into it. What made this battle so significant?
The Battle of Crete was a landmark event. It was the first large-scale airborne invasion ever attempted.
Wow.
German paratroopers landing under intense fire faced fierce resistance from British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek troops.
So this was a totally new type of warfare.
It was.
Dropping troops right into the heart of the enemy's territory.
Exactly.
What was the outcome?
While the Germans ultimately captured Crete, it was a Pyrrhic victory.
Okay, a Pyrrhic victory meaning...
A victory achieved at such a high cost that it's strategically damaging.
Okay.
The heavy losses they suffered convinced Hitler that large-scale airborne operations were too risky, and he never authorized a similar operation again.
It's like they won the battle but lost the war, at least in terms of their airborne strategy.
Right.
But even if it was costly, the Germans had achieved their objective in the Balkans. What was next on Hitler's agenda?
With the Balkans secured, Hitler could finally turn his attention to his ultimate goal, the destruction of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was one of the largest military operations in history, involving millions of troops and stretching across a vast front.
So this was the big one, the clash of titans that Hitler had been building towards. What was the thinking behind such a massive invasion?
There were several factors at play. Hitler's ideological hatred of communism was a driving force.
Right. He saw communism as a threat to his vision of a Nazi-dominated Europe.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But so was his desire for Lebensraum, living space, in the East Territory. He believed rightfully belonged to the German people.
Okay.
He also believed that the Soviet military was weak and could be defeated quickly.
So it was a cocktail of ideology, ambition, and a serious underestimation of his enemy.
It was.
What happened when those millions of German troops crossed the border into the Soviet Union?
The initial assault was devastating. They achieved major breakthroughs, pushing deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast areas, and inflicting heavy casualties.
Wow, it sounds like the Soviets were totally caught off guard.
The German army was at its peak in 1941. They had experienced troops, skilled commanders, and a well-oiled military machine honed by years of campaigning.
So it seemed like they were unstoppable.
It did.
But was it a complete walkover for the Germans?
Not quite. After the initial shock, Stalin rallied his nation, appealing to their patriotism and hatred for the invaders. He called for a total defense of the motherland, and despite suffering staggering losses, the Red Army fought back with incredible tenacity.
So the Soviets weren't going down without a fight. What were some of the key factors that allowed them to withstand that initial onslaught?
The sheer size of the Soviet Union, its vast resources, and the resilience of its people were critical to their survival.
Okay.
The Red Army, though often poorly equipped and led, fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a deep sense of patriotism.
They were fighting for their homeland, their survival.
They were.
And then there was the Russian winter, always a formidable enemy.
Absolutely. The winter of 1941-1942 was one of the coldest on record. The German army, ill-equipped for such brutal conditions, was caught completely unprepared.
Right. They weren't ready for that kind of cold.
No, they weren't. Their advance stalled as they struggled to cope with freezing temperatures, snowdrifts, and logistical nightmares.
Yeah, those supply lines must have been a nightmare.
They were.
And the Red Army, accustomed to the harsh Russian winters, seized the opportunity.
Yes, they did. They launched a series of counteroffensives, pushing the Germans back from Moscow, inflicting their first major defeat of the war.
That must have been a huge turning point, the first crack in the seemingly invincible German war machine.
It was the myth of German invincibility was shattered. Operation Barbarossa, which Hitler envisioned as a swift victory, transformed into a brutal war of attrition, a grinding conflict that would drain Germany's resources and manpower.
So this was a turning point not just in the battle, but in the entire war. The Germans were now bogged down in a massive conflict on two fronts, a strategic nightmare that would eventually lead to their downfall. But the war was far from over.
That's right. With the United States sending increasing aid to Britain and the Soviet Union, the war was becoming a truly global conflict, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would unfold in the coming years.
Well, it looks like we've reached the end of part 1 of our World War II deep dive.
It has been a fascinating start.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the rise of fascism to the initial clashes that ignited the war, but there's so much more to explore. In part 2, we'll delve into the Pacific theater, the turning points of the war, and ultimately the Allied victory. So stay tuned for more.
I'll be here.
Welcome back to our deep dive into World War II.
Good to be back.
Last time we left off with Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, a move that turned the war into a truly global conflict.
Right.
Now it's time to shift our focus to the Pacific theater and explore how a series of seemingly unrelated events drew the United States into the fray.
That's right. While the European powers were locked in this struggle for survival, Japan saw an opportunity to expand their empire in Asia, and the Pacific, their ambition was to create what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Yeah, encompassing much of East and Southeast Asia.
Co-Prosperity Sphere, it sounds almost utopian.
It does, doesn't it?
But I have a feeling it wasn't exactly paradise for the people who lived under Japanese rule.
You're right to be skeptical. Their propaganda machine painted this picture of a Pan-Asian utopia free from Western influence. But the reality was a brutal form of imperialism.
So the co-prosperity sphere was more like a Japanese domination sphere in practice.
Pretty much.
We talked earlier about their brutal occupation of Manchuria.
Right.
And those horrific experiments they conducted on prisoners.
Yes.
But their ambitions didn't stop there, did they?
No, their appetite for expansion was growing.
Okay.
They continued their aggression in China throughout the 1930s.
Right.
And in 1937, a clash between Japanese and Chinese troops near Beijing. The Marco Polo Bridge incident escalated into a full-blown war.
The Marco Polo Bridge incident, so this conflict is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War.
Yes.
It was a brutal and bloody affair, wasn't it?
It was a brutal war.
I imagine the scale of the fighting in China must have been immense, with devastating consequences for the civilian population.
Absolutely. The war ravaged China, causing widespread destruction, famine, and displacement.
Oh my God.
Millions of civilians perished, and the country's infrastructure and economy were crippled. Yet, despite the immense suffering, the Chinese people, led by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, continued to resist the Japanese invaders.
So even though they were facing such hardship, They refused to give up.
They did. They tied down a significant portion of Japan's military forces.
So Japan was bogged down in a major conflict in China, while across the world, Germany was racking up victories in Europe. Did these events in Europe influence Japan's strategy in the Pacific?
Absolutely. Japanese strategists saw the chaos in Europe as an opportunity to exploit the situation and further their own ambitions in Asia and the Pacific.
So they were watching a game of chess and waiting for the perfect moment to make their move.
Yes, with the European powers preoccupied with the war in their own backyard, Japan sensed a chance to seize control of vital resources and strategic territories.
What were they after specifically?
Their primary targets were the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia,
Mhm.
particularly the British and Dutch colonies like Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia.
Huh.
These territories were rich in resources like oil, rubber, and tin, all essential for Japan's war machine.
And there was one major power standing in their way, the United States.
That's right.
They had territories in the Pacific, like the Philippines and Guam, that were strategically important, right?
Yes, they were. The United States, although initially hesitant to get involved in another European war, was becoming increasingly alarmed by Japanese aggression in Asia.
Okay.
They saw Japan's expansionist ambitions as a direct threat to American interests in the region.
So the stage was set for a showdown in the Pacific. What were the initial steps the U.S. took to counter this perceived threat from Japan?
They initially responded with economic sanctions, hoping to curb Japan's military ambitions without resorting to armed conflict.
Okay, so trying to pressure them economically.
Right, these sanctions included an embargo on crucial materials like oil and scrap metal.
Those sanctions must have hit Japan hard, especially considering their reliance on imports for their war machine.
They did. The sanctions put immense pressure on Japan's leadership. They viewed the embargo as an act of economic warfare, a stranglehold that threatened their very survival. This pressure ultimately led them to consider a drastic and risky strategy, a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
It was a gamble, wasn't it? They knew that attacking the United States would inevitably lead to war, but they seemed to believe that a decisive blow against the Pacific Fleet would buy them time to solidify their conquests in Southeast Asia before the Americans had fully mobilized.
It was a high-stakes gamble, one that ultimately backfired spectacularly.
Right, because the attack on Pearl Harbor, while inflicting significant damage on the American fleet, failed to achieve its strategic objectives.
Exactly, and more importantly, it unified the American public against Japan.
Yeah, President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously declared December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy,
He did.
and asked Congress for a declaration of war.
The United States, with its vast industrial might and military potential, was now fully engaged in World War II, transforming the conflict into a truly global war.
It's incredible to think that a single event so carefully planned and executed could have such far-reaching consequences, essentially changing the course of history.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was a turning point not just for the United States, but for the entire war.
Okay.
It brought the industrial and military might of the U.S. onto the side of the Allies, significantly shifting the balance of power.
Right.
It also marked the beginning of a long and brutal conflict in the Pacific, a theater of war that would see some of the most ferocious fighting and horrific atrocities of World War II.
So with the U.S. officially in the war, what was Japan's next move?
Emboldened by their initial successes, Japan launched a series of rapid offensives aimed at seizing control of key territories in Southeast Asia before the Americans could mount a counterattack.
Okay, their primary targets, as we discussed earlier, were the Philippines, a U.S. territory, and the British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia.
That's right.
And their initial attacks were incredibly successful, weren't they? They seemed almost unstoppable, sweeping aside Allied defenses with incredible speed and efficiency.
The Japanese military, battle-hardened from years of fighting in China, was a formidable force.
Right.
They were well-trained, highly motivated, and expertly led their tactics, which emphasized speed, surprise, and aggression overwhelmed of impossible. Allied forces that were often outnumbered, outgunned, and unprepared for the intensity of the Japanese onslaught.
It's almost as if the Allied forces were fighting a different kind of war, still operating under old assumptions, while the Japanese were rewriting the rules of engagement.
That's a good observation. The Japanese military had studied Western tactics, but adapted them to suit their strengths and the specific conditions of the Pacific theater.
Okay.
They were masters of jungle warfare, amphibious assaults, and using terrain to their advantage.
The fall of Singapore, a supposedly impregnable British fortress, must have been a huge blow to the Allies.
It was the capture of Singapore in February 1942 was a major propaganda victory for Japan.
Okay.
It demonstrated their military prowess to the world and severely shook British confidence. It also gave Japan control of a strategically vital port and access to essential resources.
And what about the Philippines? General Douglas MacArthur was in command there, wasn't he?
Yes, MacArthur led the American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. They put up a valiant defense, holding out for months on the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. However, they were eventually overwhelmed by the Japanese onslaught.
That must have been a bitter defeat for the Americans, especially considering the sacrifices made by the Filipino people fighting alongside them.
It was a devastating loss. Thousands of American and Filipino prisoners of war were subjected to a horrific ordeal, the Bataan Death March.
The Bataan Death March.
They were forced to march for miles in brutal conditions, with many dying along the way from exhaustion disease or at the hands of their captors.
A truly horrific event.
It was a stark reminder of the brutality and inhumanity of war.
And what happened to MacArthur?
MacArthur was ordered to evacuate the Philippines before the final surrender as he left. He famously vowed, "I shall return."
A promise he would ultimately fulfill.
He did.
So the early months of the war in the Pacific were a string of victories for the Japanese.
They were.
It seems like nothing could stop them, but the tide began to turn right. What were some of the key battles that shifted the momentum in favor of the Allies?
One of the first signs that the Japanese advance could be halted was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942.
The Battle of the Coral Sea.
It was the first major carrier versus carrier battle in history.
Okay.
And while it was tactically inconclusive, it was a strategic victory for the Allies.
I remember learning about carrier battles in history class. They were a totally new type of naval warfare, with aircraft taking center stage. Why was the Battle of the Coral Sea so significant?
Well, the battle prevented a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would have posed a direct threat to Australia.
Okay.
More importantly, it demonstrated the growing strength of the U.S. Navy and the crucial role of carrier-based air power in the vast expanses of the Pacific. It was a sign that the Japanese could be challenged and their advance could be stopped.
So the Coral Sea was a morale booster for the Allies, showing that the Japanese weren't invincible. And then just a month later came the Battle of Midway, often considered the turning point of the Pacific War.
Midway was a decisive victory for the U.S. Navy, achieved against incredible odds. They sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling their naval aviation force and decisively shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. It was a masterpiece of strategy, intelligence, and daring tactics.
It sounds like the Americans were learning from their early defeats and becoming more adept at countering Japanese tactics.
That's precisely what happened. They were breaking Japanese codes, anticipating their movements, and using their growing industrial might to produce ships and aircraft at an astonishing rate.
So they were adapting and innovating.
The Japanese never fully recovered from their losses at Midway, and the initiative shifted to the Allies.
So Midway was a turning point,
It was.
but the war was far from over. The Allied forces still faced a long and bloody road to Victory Island, hopping across the Pacific, battling a determined and ruthless enemy.
That's right. The island hopping campaign was a grueling and costly strategy. Each island had to be taken by force, often involving amphibious landings against heavily fortified Japanese positions.
I can only imagine.
Battles like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were incredibly fierce, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides.
These island battles were infamous for their brutality, weren't they? The Japanese defenders fought with incredible ferocity, often to the last man. What motivated them to fight with such unwavering determination?
A complex mix of factors contributed to their tenacity. Their military indoctrination emphasized unwavering loyalty to the emperor and a warrior code that viewed surrender as dishonorable and death in battle as a glorious end.
So they were prepared to die for their beliefs.
They were trained to fight to the death, and they did so with fanatical zeal.
It sounds like a clash of cultures, with the American forces facing an enemy unlike any they'd encountered before. This must have made the island hopping campaign even more challenging for the Allies.
It did. The Japanese resistance was fierce, and the terrain on many of these islands was incredible.
Japanese pilots deliberately crashing their planes into Allied ships.
Exactly.
It must have been terrifying for the sailors facing those attacks.
It was a terrifying experience.
Yeah.
The kamikaze attacks were a sign of Japan's desperation, a willingness to sacrifice everything in a last-ditch effort to defend their homeland.
Right.
They inflicted significant damage on the Allied fleet, and the psychological impact of those attacks was profound.
Okinawa was a brutal battle, and the
Yeah.
casualties were staggering. It seems like a foreshadowing of the potential devastation that could have occurred had the Allies been forced to invade the Japanese mainland.
That's right. The Battle of Okinawa raised serious concerns among American military planners about the potential cost of invading Japan.
Okay.
Estimates suggested that an invasion could result in millions of casualties on both sides. The prospect of a protracted and bloody campaign on the Japanese home islands was a daunting prospect.
So the war in the Pacific was reaching a climax, and the Allies were facing a difficult dilemma: how to end the war without resorting to a costly and potentially devastating invasion of Japan. But while these agonizing decisions were being made, the war in Europe was also reaching its final stages.
You're right. By 1944, the tide had decisively turned against Germany. The Red Army, after years of brutal fighting and unimaginable losses, was on the offensive.
So the Soviets, after enduring unimaginable suffering, were on the march, fueled by a thirst for revenge and a determination to crush the Nazi regime.
They were a force to be reckoned with. Their victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and other key battles had shattered the myth of German invincibility and demonstrated the growing strength and resilience of the Soviet military machine.
Right.
They were determined to make the Germans pay for the horrors they had inflicted on the Soviet people.
And what was happening on the Western Front? Were the British and Americans just sitting back and watching the Soviets do all the heavy lifting?
Not at all. In the West, the Allied forces led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlords, the landing in Normandy, France.
Operation Overlords.
This would open up a second front against Germany, putting immense pressure on their forces, who were now fighting a two-front war.
D-Day, as it's known, is one of the most iconic events of World War II. What made this operation so challenging?
The sheer scale and complexity of the operation were unprecedented. It involved coordinating thousands of ships, aircraft, and troops from multiple nations.
Okay.
The German defenses were formidable, with heavily fortified beaches and a determined enemy waiting for them. The success of the Normandy landings was a testament to the meticulous planning, the bravery of the Allied forces, and the crucial role played by resistance fighters in France.
It was a truly multinational effort, a testament to the power of collaboration in the face of a common enemy.
It was.
And the fighting on the beaches of Normandy was incredibly fierce, wasn't it?
It was the Allied forces faced heavy resistance, and casualties were high on both sides. But their determination, combined with their superior firepower and air support, eventually prevailed.
Okay.
The breakout from Normandy in July 1944 marked the beginning of a rapid advance through France. They liberated Paris in August and pushed eastward towards Germany, putting relentless pressure on the crumbling Nazi regime.
So the net was closing in on Germany, with the Soviets advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing from the west. But Hitler wasn't ready to give up, was he?
No, Hitler, clinging to his delusional belief in ultimate victory, refused to surrender, ordering his troops to fight to the death.
Wow.
He rejected any attempts at negotiation and demanded a fanatical defense of every inch of German territory, even as the Allied armies closed in on Berlin.
This stubborn refusal to accept defeat must have prolonged the war and led to even more needless suffering.
You're right. Hitler's fanaticism and his refusal to acknowledge reality resulted in countless unnecessary deaths. The final months of the war in Europe were chaotic and brutal, with cities reduced to rubble, millions of refugees fleeing the fighting, and atrocities committed on both sides. But the outcome was inevitable.
Right.
The Allied forces, with their superior resources and manpower, were unstoppable.
So the war in Europe was coming to a close.
Yes,
But a final reckoning with the Nazi regime was still to come.
it was.
And in the Pacific, the Allies were closing in on Japan, but facing the agonizing decision of whether to invade or find another way to end the war. We'll explore these final chapters of World War II in Part 3 of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our World War II deep dive.
It's good to be back.
Last time we left off with the Allied forces closing in on Germany from both east and west,
Right.
and in the Pacific, a looming question mark over how to finish the fight against Japan.
Yes, a lot of uncertainty at that point.
So while victory was in sight, the path to get there was far from clear. We were talking about the brutal battle for Okinawa,
Right.
which gave everyone a taste of just how fierce the Japanese defense of their homeland would be.
It did. Okinawa was a bloody bat.
And it made the Allied leaders really reconsider the potential costs of a full-scale invasion of Japan.
Absolutely. Okinawa was a wake-up call.
Yeah, they realized that an invasion could result in casualties on a scale never before seen in modern warfare.
Millions of casualties on both sides, a truly horrifying thought.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is.
So it's no wonder they were looking for an alternative to such a devastating scenario.
They were desperate for another option.
And this is where the Manhattan Project enters the picture.
The Manhattan Project, a top-secret American program to develop the atomic bomb.
In July 1945, the first atomic bomb was successfully detonated at Trinity Site in New Mexico.
Yes, a pivotal moment in history.
Ushering in a terrifying new era, a weapon of unimaginable destructive power.
Yeah.
It's hard to grasp the weight of that moment.
It is.
The realization that humanity now possessed the ability to obliterate entire cities in an instant.
It changed the world forever.
And the decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan was incredibly complex.
One of the most difficult decisions in human history.
Laden with moral and ethical considerations, President Truman, facing the prospect of a prolonged and bloody invasion,
Right?
ultimately authorized the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945.
Hoping to force Japan's unconditional surrender and bring the war to a swift end.
Hiroshima, it's a name that has become synonymous with the horrors of atomic warfare.
Right.
What was the immediate impact of that first bomb?
Devastation on an unprecedented scale. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, unleashed a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT.
15,000 tons of TNT.
It instantly killed an estimated 80,000 people and caused widespread destruction.
It's almost impossible to comprehend the suffering and destruction caused by that single bomb, and yet even after this unimaginable act, Japan's leadership hesitated to surrender. What were they hoping for at that point?
The Japanese government was deeply divided. Some argued for continued resistance, believing they could inflict enough casualties on the Allies to force a negotiated peace,
Okay.
one that might preserve their emperor and some of their pre-war territories. Others recognized the futility of further fighting and urged the emperor to accept unconditional surrender.
So they were caught between a deeply ingrained warrior code that viewed surrender as dishonorable
Right.
and the stark reality of a weapon that could potentially annihilate their nation.
Exactly. It was a difficult decision for them.
What finally tipped the scales?
The United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki, on August 9, 1945.
Nagasaki.
This bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was even more powerful than the one used on Hiroshima,
Even more powerful.
resulting in an estimated 40,000 immediate deaths.
2 cities almost completely obliterated in the span of 3 days. The psychological impact of those bombings must have been immense, not just for the Japanese people, but for the entire world.
It was a turning point in human history. The world entered a new era, the atomic age.
Faced with this terrifying new reality, what did Japan's leadership do?
Emperor Hirohito, recognizing the futility of further resistance, finally intervened. He broke the deadlock in the government and urged his advisors to accept the Allied demands for unconditional surrender.
So the emperor himself stepped in and made the decision.
He did.
What a momentous decision that must have been for the emperor to break with centuries of tradition and essentially admit defeat.
It was a historic moment.
It speaks volumes about the impact of those atomic bombs.
It does.
On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people in a radio broadcast.
Announcing their surrender.
It was the first time the Japanese people had ever heard their emperor's voice, and his words sent shockwaves through the nation.
The war was over. But the world had entered a new and uncertain era, one shaped by the terrifying power of atomic weapons.
Relief mixed with grief, uncertainty about the future. I imagine a whole range of emotions washing over the Japanese people in those final days of the war. And for the Allied nations, it was a time for celebration, but also a time for reflection.
Absolutely. It was a victory, hard-won, achieved at a staggering cost. Millions had perished, entire cities lay in ruins, and the world was grappling with the implications of this new atomic age.
The end of World War II was a pivotal moment in human history. It marked the end of a global conflict that had reshaped the political landscape, pushed technology to new heights and forced humanity to confront the darkest aspects of its nature.
It was a war that changed everything.
And looking back, we see the devastating consequences of unchecked aggression,
Yes.
the horrors of totalitarian regimes, and the unimaginable human cost of war,
It's a stark reminder of the fragility of peace.
and the importance of standing up to tyranny and intolerance.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive: the seeds of conflict, the major players, the turning points, and the ultimate outcome. But beyond the facts and figures, I think what really resonates are the stories of courage and resilience, of sacrifice and loss.
It's the human stories that stay with us.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of global conflict, individual acts of bravery and compassion can make a difference. World War II was a defining moment for humanity, a global catastrophe that forced us to confront our capacity for both good and evil.
It was a time of great darkness and great heroism.
The lessons learned from this conflict continue to shape our world today, reminding us that the choices we make, both individually and collectively, have far-reaching consequences.
Our actions have consequences.
That's a powerful thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into World War II. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and perhaps even a little bit inspiring.
It's been a privilege to explore this complex and challenging topic with you.
We encourage you to continue learning, questioning, and engaging in thoughtful discussions about history and its impact on our world today. And remember, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure and hope can triumph over adversity. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the flame of curiosity burning bright.